Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. First, I want to acknowledge the miracle of the miners in Chile and thank God for the survival of each and every one. It is a tribute to all the countries who cooperated with each other to assure the best possible outcome for these courageous and inspiring miners. I am Doris Wise Montrose. I'm founder and president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. CJHS was founded 4 years ago as an educational and activist organization. Our premise being that the legacy of the Holocaust is not only something that must be mourned, but also something that must be acted upon. Today, Western freedoms, to say nothing of the very existence of the Jewish state, are being challenged as they rarely have in history. CJHS constantly seeks new ways to meet these challenges, from raising public awareness to building alliances. That means operating in today's rapidly changing media landscape, connecting with legacy journalists and bloggers, taking advantage of all the tools that digital media has to offer. I encourage you to visit our website, www.cjhsla.org, where we are constantly adding content and posting videos of our past events, as well as announcements of our future events. It also means having the honor of bringing together audiences such as this one with distinguished guests like Mitchell Bard. He is here to speak about his new book, The Arab Lobby, The Invisible Alliance That Undermines America's Interest in the Middle East. His is the first book to debunk the myth that an all-powerful Israeli lobby controls American policymakers. In it, Mitchell Bard shows us precisely how a much more powerful and less visible Arab lobby is acting to influence the United States. It is a meticulously researched and shocking expose that highlights in particular the Saudi stranglehold on our American Middle East policies. The Arab lobby documents 70 years of complicity at the highest levels of government and business. It tells the story of invisible alliances working to undermine the bond between the U.S. and Israel. Even as we speak, Arabists in the State Department, defense contractors, former government officials, academics, corporations with business interests in the Middle East, NGOs or non-governmental organizations, non-evangelical Christians, and foreign leaders and diplomats are working in support of regimes in the Middle East whose values are not consistent with our own, particularly Saudi Arabia. It is a little-known historical fact that U.S. policymakers have been and continue to be coerced to ignore Saudi human rights abuses, their support of terrorism, and their opposition of American interests. Our ignorance is vast. For instance, how many of us do not know that Saudi Arabia is leveraging nearly $1 trillion invested in the United States to influence American policy? Or that they have spent nearly $100 million on lobbyists, consultants, and public relations firms in America. In addition, the Saudis and Arab states and other Arab states have more than $300 million invested in the American education system, mostly in our colleges, but increasingly also K through 12, to assert their influence on the education of our children. There are 125 Middle East studies programs at our universities, and our own Department of Education is funding 14 Middle East centers and spends about $4 million a year on student fellowships in these programs. How many of us realize that the United States has sold Saudi Arabia more than $100 billion worth of weaponry, much of which they can't use or maintain, and none of this lessens the need for us to defend their kingdom. With our economy faltering and critical midterm elections right around the corner, the Arab lobby could not be more timely. The author is one of the leading authorities on the United States Middle East policy. Dr. Bard is the executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise and director of the Jewish Virtual Library, the world's most comprehensive online encyclopedia of Jewish history and culture. He has written or edited 22 books, including 48 Hours of Kristallnacht, night of destruction, dawn of the Holocaust, forgotten victims, the abandonment of Americans in Hitler's camps, from tragedy to triumph, the politics behind the rescue of Ethiopian Jewry, myths and facts, a guide to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and on one foot, a Middle East guide for the perplexed, or how to respond on your way to class when your best friend joins an anti-Israel protest. Mitchell Bard has appeared on numerous news channels, both in television and radio, including Al Jazeera. And tonight we have him here to alert us to the challenge of shaking off these long-standing toxic alliances. We must stop capitulating to Arab demands. Now is the time, he writes, to wake up and break the nefarious ties that have encouraged global terrorism to spread like wildfire. Please welcome Dr. Mitchell Bard.
Thank you very much. I just happen to have the book with me.
Only one?
I believe there are more. Thank you very much, Doris, for making this possible, and all of you for braving the traffic here in Los Angeles. Having lived here for a time, I can sympathize, although now I live in Washington, D.C., which I believe now may have supplanted Los Angeles as #1 for the worst traffic. It's always nice to get such a warm introduction. To be honest, when you speak as much as I do, you can't always be sure, though. At one event, the person introducing me said, "I, as your chairman, do not have to make a long and boring speech because we've invited Mitchell Bard here for that purpose." And just to give you an idea of what a genius you really do have here before you tonight, at one recent event I was speaking and I was getting ready to come to the event and was getting dressed, and I was pulling on my pants, and as I did, I suddenly realized they were a lot snugger than usual, and it dawned on me that I had brought my son's bar mitzvah suit instead of my own. In addition to all of the wonderful things Doris said, I'd also encourage you to visit our website, jewishvirtuallibrary.org. Everything you want to know about everything from anti-Semitism to Zionism. It also talks about the lobbies, as well as the weekly myth and fact that you can sign up for on the website. Now, people ask, of course, first thing often, why did you write a book about the Arab lobby? And in fact, I've been doing research on the domestic influences on U.S. Middle East policy now for more than 20 years. In fact, I was just down the road a piece doing my PhD dissertation on that very subject at UCLA back in the mid-'80s. And my first book was about the influences on U.S. Middle East policy, and I looked at both the Israeli and Arab lobbies, and I've been doing it ever since. But it really is in the last few years when the Israeli lobby became obsessively scrutinized, demonized, and mischaracterized that it became clear to me that there was a need to bring greater attention to the other part of the equation involved in Middle East policy. You had what really were a series of mostly crackpot theories about an all-powerful Israeli lobby that were given a special credence when a couple of academics wrote a book called The Israeli Lobby that suddenly gave some new credibility to what really had been dismissed as conspiracy theories up until then. And so what I wanted to do was to bring to the attention of people who really had never heard of an Arab lobby the fact that one has existed, that in many cases the lobby is older and in some instances more powerful than the pro-Israel lobby, and to let people know that not only does it exist, but when and how it has influence and the ways in which it is threatening American values and interests. Now, what is the Arab lobby as I define it? Well, for one thing, it's a kind of many-headed hydra. One of the reasons why it's so often said that there is no Arab lobby is just because it's difficult to pin down. You can't go down to H Street in Washington, D.C. and see an Arab lobby building the way you can visit the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC's headquarters. So there's no central address. There's really two groups or two components of the Arab lobby as I see it. One is largely driven by oil interests, and that is led by Saudi Arabia primarily, with the backing of Arabists in our State Department. These are diplomats who have a particular view of U.S. policy that is based on the idea that the most important thing to the United States is securing the supply of oil, and that in order to secure that supply, we have to keep the Saudis happy at all costs. And there are some other aspects of their interests that I'll get to in a few minutes. In addition to that, there are, of course, the oil companies who have their own profit-oriented interests, and to a large degree also defense contractors, as Doris mentioned, who have an interest in being able to sell as many weapons as possible to the Saudis as well as to other Gulf states. Now, the other element of the lobby is one that I describe as the domestic lobby, which is comprised primarily of Arab American and Muslim American organizations, some of the non-evangelical Christians, and again, some of those same State Department Arabists. And the focus of this part of the lobby is really on the Palestinian issue. And to a large extent, they are a lobby that is not pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab, but they're more anti-Israel. That is, if you look at their resolutions and their lobbying agenda in Congress, with very rare exceptions, it's focused more on how can we try to punish Israel or create divisions between the United States and Israel than it is in trying to help advance the peace process or help in some way the Palestinian people. Now, the Arab lobby has one essential disadvantage to begin with, and that is it's very difficult to see how they could ever represent, quote-unquote, the Arabs or the Muslims, because there are 1.5 billion Muslims with a whole variety of different approaches to their faith. You have 21 Arab countries who all have very different and often competing agendas, and so there's really no way that any individual organization or group of organizations could represent, quote-unquote, the Arabs. The other problem that they face is that they have very small numbers. That is, there are very few Arab Americans or Muslim Americans in the United States, and even within that small population, the vast, or not the vast majority, but a significant percentage of Arab Americans are actually Lebanese Christians who, for the most part, disagree with the agenda of the Arab lobby. That is, they are not particularly concerned with the Palestinian issue or in creating divisions between the United States and Israel. In fact, the reason that they're in the United States in the first place in many cases is because they were driven out of their homes in Lebanon by the Palestinians or by some of the Muslim groups in Lebanon. So they don't sympathize. So you have a very small minority within a minority of Arab Americans who are supportive of this Arab lobby agenda. And then the third major mitigating factor that minimizes the domestic lobby's influence is the lack of political support. That is, if you look at the latest Gallup poll, 63% of Americans sympathize with the State of Israel, 15% sympathize with the Palestinians. And this has been a historic trend. In fact, it's only gotten worse over the years as Israel's gotten greater support. And so it's very difficult for the Arab lobby to go to Congress and to make a case that they're representing the national interest or the views of the American public when there is very little evidence to show that the American people support their positions. So what the Arab lobby has done, and this is particularly true of the Saudis, is to take a top-down approach to lobbying as opposed to a bottom-up. That is, the pro-Israel community has always prided itself on being a grassroots movement, to mobilize the masses, to influence the members of Congress and the other decision makers. The Saudis and the Arab lobby in general take just the opposite approach because they don't have a means to reach the grassroots, they don't have the numbers, they don't have the public support. They try to go directly to the decision makers, influence the few who have power over the many. And so one of the reasons why the pro-Israel lobby is very transparent, and we know a lot about what they do is because you see them out there lobbying Congress in a very visible way, and the records are all public, whereas the Arab lobby does most of its work behind the scenes, that you have Saudi government officials, diplomats, the ambassador, the king in particular, going directly to the White House to talk to the president or talking to the Secretary of State. And often we don't know that these talks are going on. You had the Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador for more than 20 years, who used to play racquetball and tennis with Colin Powell and David Jones and the top decision makers in our government, and it was something that the average person would never know about. Now, Bandar also was quite candid in explaining the whole Saudi approach to influencing American policy. He said, basically, what we want to do is take care of people when they leave office, because if you do that, you'd be surprised how nice they are to you when they are in office. So they have the reputation over the years of taking very good care of former government officials who end up in very cushy consulting jobs with the Saudis, who work in the defense industry, who work in various think tanks, and end up making a very comfortable living, thanks in large part to the fact that they were very pro-Saudi while they were in the government. And this is a very bipartisan approach by the Saudis, by the way. They do the same thing with every president. They give money to their presidential libraries. They support the First Lady's causes. Sometimes they do it before the president it becomes the president. Sometimes it's after, in the hope of showing government leaders, our presidents even, that there is a good reason for them to be pro-Saudi. And one of my favorite examples was the case of Bill Clinton, where you had at one point, this obscure southern governor went to the Saudis and said, I'd like you to fund a Middle East Studies Center at the University of Arkansas. The Saudis probably looked at him and thought, where's Arkansas? And told him, no. Then, not too long afterwards, this obscure southern governor suddenly is the Democratic candidate for president. And what do you know? Suddenly, the University of Arkansas gets $3.5 million for Middle East studies. Then that obscure governor is elected president of the United States, of course, and shortly after he's inaugurated, the University of Arkansas miraculously gets a check for $20 million for the study of the Middle East. So this is one of the ways that the Arab lobby operates and has been very successful. Now, I want to be clear that unlike most of the folks who write about the Israeli lobby, I do not for a second suggest that the people who believe in a pro-Arab position, a pro-Palestinian position, pro-Saudi position, are not entitled to lobby for those views. In our democratic system of government, as long as they're doing it according to the law and it's transparent, they are entitled to do their best to try to influence U.S. policy. And I also believe that the Arab lobby is not all-powerful, the way Walton Mearsheimer and others have said about the Israeli lobby. That, as I'll say in a minute, I think they have a great deal of influence, but it's some influence over some things some of the time, and that policy is actually very nuanced, and that sometimes the Israeli lobby wins on issues and sometimes it loses, and the same is true for the Arab lobby. But it's very naive to believe that there wouldn't be two rival lobbies. I mean, if you think about any other issue, whether it's gun control or abortion rights or health care, it's never a one-sided issue. There's always at least one other organizational interest that's lobbying it. So the notion that somehow the pro-Israel community would be the only ones trying to influence U.S. Middle East policy really never made any sense in the first place. Now, as I said, the most powerful part of the lobby by far is the oil lobby, the Saudi-led part of the lobby. And I cover a lot of this in the book going back 70 years of history, and we can't go through all of that tonight, so I want to just focus on a couple of things. Now, when you think about Saudi Arabia today, of course, you say, well, the Saudis have tremendous wealth. They have the greatest oil reserves. Of course, we're going to be willing to take their interests into account. But the remarkable thing I found in doing the research for this book was we had that same attitude of letting the Saudis coerce us 70 years ago when the Saudis were just discovering oil. They hadn't pumped a barrel yet. We didn't need any of their oil, and the Saudis essentially were bankrupt. They used to carry their wealth around in a treasure chest in the desert, and when the king got through handing out money to the different tribes to keep them loyal, he'd be out of money and he'd turn to the oil companies and say, I need money. And then the oil companies would turn to the U.S. government and say, the king needs money, and we would give them money. And throughout the last 70 years, the Saudis would consistently threaten to somehow take our oil away, give it to someone else, if we didn't continue to do their bidding. And so we essentially have a Faustian bargain that we have signed with the Saudis over the year, where the Saudis care about one thing and one thing only, and that is the survival of the royal family. And they recognize that the best way to survive is to have the United States keep them in power. The United States, our interest is in getting access to the Saudi oil. So we have a bargain that in exchange for getting the oil, we agree to keep the royal heads on the royal shoulders. But this has certain negative repercussions as well, because when we buy the Saudi oil, the profits they use are partly to keep us addicted to oil. That is, they behave much like drug pushers in manipulating the price of oil in such a way that they keep the price high enough to make a good profit, but low enough so that we in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world don't feel sufficient incentive to invest in alternative sources of energy that might change our relationship with the Saudis. And just to give you an example, you would think, wouldn't you, that the Saudis would want to make as much money as they possibly could. So a couple of years ago, when the price of oil hit a record $147 a barrel, you would have thought the Saudis couldn't be happier and that they would just hope that it would continue to go through the roof. But at that very moment, when oil was at its all-time high, the Saudi oil minister said, we believe that the ideal price of oil is actually between $70 and $80 a barrel. Guess what the price of oil is today? The average is about $75 a barrel. Interesting coincidence. You can look back as far as 1967, when the U.S. government understood the danger we were in. One of the State Department Arabists wrote in 1967 a study about the dangers of being so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And he said, 67, we need to invest in alternative sources of energy. But he said, in conclusion, it's not feasible at this time, so instead what we should do is have less strong ties to Israel. And this is essentially the relationship that the Arabists believe in, that the answer to our problems is not more investment in alternative energy, it's to reduce our investment relationship with Israel. Now, what else do the Saudis use the money for? Well, one thing they do, as Doris alluded to, is buy arms. They want the latest and greatest weapons. And as she also mentioned, the fact is, number one, they don't need them, and number two, they can't use them. And so we've given them over $100 billion worth of arms. We're about to have the largest arms sale in U.S. history and give them another $60 billion under the pretext that this will somehow help them defend themselves against an Iranian nuclear weapon. And it's just complete nonsense. We saw this argument back, for example, in 1981, where the Saudis had to have our latest and greatest radar plane, the AWACS radar plane. And the administration was going around Capitol Hill saying to the pro-Israel members of Congress who were worried, they said, don't worry, the Saudis are incompetent. They won't threaten Israel. And then they would say to the other members of Congress, we need to give this to the Saudis so they can defend themselves against the Soviet Union. And nobody seemed to recognize this paradox that the Saudis would be so strong that they could take on the Soviets, but not strong enough to bother the Israelis. And we hear this same kind of argument being made today. Now, why does the United States go along with this? Well, one reason has to do with the lobbying of the Arab lobby, where the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, for example, said, what we need to do is go district by district and show how many jobs will be created by these arms sales, so that we make it a jobs issue more than even a security issue. But also, the Pentagon wants to sell these weapons, because what happens is, by selling lots and lots of, for example, F-15s to the Saudis, that allows them to lower the overall cost of an F-15 to the U.S. Air Force. And it allows them to keep in service certain weapon systems that they might otherwise have to cancel if they weren't getting enough orders. So the Pentagon sees this as being in their interest. And certainly the defense companies believe it's in their interest. And it's also partially a transfer of wealth. We give the Saudis billions of dollars for oil, and they give it right back to us for these arms. So there is an interest there that you can justify. But there's another problem with how this relationship works and how this money is spent. And the dangerous thing is that the Saudis are at the same time undermining our interests in the Middle East. They're undermining our values, and they're directly and indirectly threatening our security. And let me tell you how. So first of all, how do they undermine our interests in the Middle East? Well, one way is by supporting terrorists. For many years, one of the principal supporters of the PLO at the height of their terrorist activities were the Saudis. More recently, they are large donors and supporters of Hamas. Now, the problem with supporting Hamas, especially recently, was that weakened the Fatah party, led by Mahmoud Abbas, who's America's favorite Palestinian at the moment, who we would like to see make peace with Israel because he's a relative moderate. But by the Saudis strengthening Hamas vis-a-vis Abbas, they were actually undermining the whole U.S. strategy for pushing the peace process forward. If you go back in history, there's another example. Perhaps the most dramatic example of how they sabotaged peace was in the Camp David negotiations, where Anwar Sadat told Jimmy Carter that the key to securing the Israeli-Egyptian peace and expanding it to a comprehensive peace in the Middle East was the support of the Saudis. And Jimmy Carter said, "Don't worry, I'm Jimmy Carter. The Saudis will do whatever I ask. They've already assured me that they're going to support the peace process." Lo and behold, they didn't. In fact, they did just the opposite. They led the Arab League effort to ostracize Egypt for a number of years, and did everything they could to make sure that no other Arab state would join into the peace process, or that the Palestinians would enter into the autonomy talks. And as I'll mention in a few moments, they're continuing the same approach of undermining peace in the Middle East today. So this is one way they're undermining our interest, at least are undermining our interest in peace and stability in the region. The second thing that they undermine is the values that the United States believes in freedom, democracy, and human rights. Saudi Arabia may be the most intolerant country in the world. They are anti-Semitic, they are anti-Christian, they're anti-any non-Muslim minority. And they also are regular serial human rights abusers. If you talk about what apartheid state there is in the Middle East, there is one. It's called Saudi Arabia, and the way they treat women. And yet the United States has essentially stood by and allowed the Saudis to abuse human rights for years. And it wasn't just Saudi citizens. Over the years, American citizens have also been subject to discrimination by the Saudis. And for many years, you can read these incredible remarks by U.S. State Department officials who would say, well, the fact that they won't let Jews in, or they're discriminating against Jews, it's okay, it's their culture, we don't want to rock the boat, we don't want to do anything to make them unhappy. And so for many years, we were complicit in discriminating against our own citizens in Saudi Arabia for fear of making them unhappy. The one example, in fact, of a U.S. president standing up to the Saudis. The only one I can really think of was in the 1960s. John Kennedy told the King of Saudi Arabia, "You have to end slavery." A century after the Civil War in the United States, the Saudis were still practicing legal slavery, and he said it was unacceptable, and the Saudis, at least legally, outlawed it after Kennedy put the pressure on them, which says to me that if a U.S. president does use his influence and does use our political, economic, and military leverage, we can change policy, and there's no reason why we in the United States have to accept the idea that the Saudis have their own culture and therefore they can do whatever they want in terms of discriminating against their own citizens or our citizens. Finally, how does the Saudi policy threaten our security? Well, the principal way is sponsoring terrorism. Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Stuart Levy, said, quote, "If I could somehow snap my fingers and cut off the funding from one country, it would be Saudi Arabia." The fact is, the Saudis are the principal sponsors of a variety of different terrorist groups around the world. And because Americans came to see them as sponsors of terror after 9/11, when, of course, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, they began to invest very heavily in trying to change their image through public relations and lobbying. So just since 9/11, they've invested something close to $100 million on various public relations firms and K Street lobbyists in order to try to convince both the American people and the Congress that no, they're not really supporters of terrorists, but they're somehow cooperating with us in the war on terror. As Doris mentioned, they've also invested another $130 million in higher education in an effort to change the perceptions of the next generation of Americans. They want the next generation to see them as our crucial allies in the Middle East. They want to see the next generation undercut the alliance between the United States and Israel. They want to promote their own brand of Islam, Wahhabi Islam. And they want to deny the existence of any radical Islamic threat to the United States or anyone else. And of even greater concern, I think, is that they are trying to spread some of these values that they have in their own educational system into our education system. For example, in one school, there was a map on the wall of the Middle East that was missing just one country. Can you guess which one? Israel. And they had a textbook that taught that the Jews were conspiring against Islam, and in their 12th grade textbook it said that on the day of judgment the trees will speak to the Muslims and say, "O Muslim, O servant of God, the Jews are hiding here behind me, come and kill them." And it's not just about Jews. They also quote from another part of the Quran in which it said, "The apes are the people of the Sabbath, the Jews are swine, the unbelievers of Jesus' table, the Christians." Jews are apes, Christians are pigs. These are some of the teachings that are very common in Saudi textbooks. They're finding their way into the United States, and that particular school that I'm talking about is not a madrasa in Pakistan or a Taliban school in Afghanistan. It's actually a Saudi-funded school in Fairfax, Virginia. Now, if you read the book, The Israeli Lobby, you were treated to this notion that the Israeli lobby is all-powerful. And this has become a constant theme, and it's a theme that you can read in State Department documents going back years, that somehow this cabal of Jews is exerting too much influence on U.S. Middle East policy. Well, I think you can destroy Walter Mearsheimer's entire argument with just two words: Barack Obama. And it's a nonpartisan, look, this is a nonpartisan thing. I can use another two words: George Bush, H.W. Bush. or two other words, Dwight Eisenhower, or two other words, Jimmy Carter. Because in each of those cases, you can see that by no means were these presidents kowtowing or listening or being controlled by the pro-Israel lobby. And let me just talk a little bit more specifically about the case of Barack Obama and where we are today in the peace process, to show you a kind of case study of the Arab lobby's influence. Now, the Israeli lobby's basic philosophy is that the government of Israel, as the democratically elected representatives of the people, should decide the fate of Israel and should engage in direct negotiations with the Arabs, the Palestinians, the other Arab states, to negotiate a now two-state solution is the preferred result. The Arab lobby has a different approach, especially the Arabists in the State Department. They believe a number of things. One, that Israel has to be coerced, that Israel isn't going to make peace on its own unless the United States uses its power to force them. They believe that the Israeli people are either too stupid, too immature, too evil to know what's good for them, and that they should be saved in spite of themselves. In fact, there's a very famous article written by one of the State Department officials that was called "How to Save Israel in Spite of Itself." A third thing that is common belief in the Arab lobby is that the Palestinian issue is the most important one. That if we just solve the Palestinian issue, then everything else goes away. Despite the obvious problem of Afghanistan not going away if Palestinian peace broke out tomorrow, or that Sunnis and Shiites would stop killing each other in Iraq if there was peace in the Palestinian issue, and so on. You can list a whole number of cases to disprove that. But that's the basic beliefs. And finally, there's a belief that the United States has to be actively engaged in peacemaking, because if we're not constantly pushing, especially pushing Israel, then there will be this vacuum that will create instability, and usually it's filled by violence, and bad things happen for American interests. So I believe if you look at those two different philosophies of the Arab lobby and the Israeli lobby, and then look at the policies pursued by President Obama, it's pretty clear that he is not pursuing the Israeli lobby agenda. That, in fact, he is pursuing a policy more consistent with the Arab lobby view. Now, you can like it or not like it. Let me just lay it out in terms of whether President Obama is accomplishing the goals that he is setting for himself in the first year. Now, when he came to office, one of the main points of his campaign was he was not George Bush. That his domestic policies were going to not be George Bush, they were going to be very different, and that his foreign policy was going to be very different. And this applied to Middle East policy as well. And in the case of the Middle East, he wanted to show that he, unlike George Bush, is a friend of the Arab and Muslim world. And so one of the first things he did, in fact, the very first interview he gave was not to the Washington Post or the New York Times, it was to an Arab publication. And one of the first major foreign policy speeches he gave was where? Cairo. And he went and he gave a very good speech in Cairo. I thought it was a very good speech in trying to explain to the Muslim world and make the case that the United States is not in any kind of conflict with Islam or with the Arab world, and that we want to be on good relations. Perfectly good speech, nothing I would complain about. But the problem was that what was the impact in terms of the Muslim world? Did the Muslim world all suddenly fall in love with Barack Obama as a result of the speech? Well, in fact, they didn't. And if you look at some of the recent polls, you see that he is not particularly popular in the Arab and Muslim world. He's more popular than George Bush, but he still has not by any means won them over by his policy or by his speech. And one of the reasons had to do with listening to the Arabists and making a mistake about where he gave the speech. I mean, why was it a problem to speak in Cairo? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One is Cairo is one of the most repressive countries in the Middle East. And it represses the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. And so if you're in the Muslim world and you see the United States, the president, going to a dictatorial regime to speak there and to bolster their president, What's the reaction? It wasn't, ah, boy, he's so much different from George Bush, and look at how he's reaching out to us. The reaction in many places was just the opposite. He's just like all the rest, because here he is just propping up a dictator who happens to be pro-American, and one that is actually repressing Muslims in his country. So it backfired in a way. The second thing that happened was that he was led to believe by his advisors, the Arabists again, that what was important was to publicly criticize Israel, go after the settlement issue, and to make clear that he was going to aggressively pursue a Palestinian-Israel peace that would lead to a Palestinian state. Again, nothing necessarily wrong with that approach or that goal. But the problem was that he was led to believe that this is what the Saudis wanted, and if he did those things, they would go along with his policy objectives in the Middle East. So what happened on the way to Cairo? Do you know where he stopped? No, you don't know, because nobody wanted to report about it. It was kept largely a secret until many months later that he stopped in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And he went to the king and he said, okay, I've been making an issue of the Israeli settlements. I'm making the Palestinian-Israeli peace issue a very high priority for me, and we're going to be pushing very hard for a Palestinian state. Now I want you to help me. And one of the things I want you to do to help me is to make certain gestures to Israel to show the Israelis that if they make peace with the Palestinians, that at the end of the day there will be some normalization in relations with the rest of the Arab world. And King Abdullah said, jump in the lake. So, and for months afterwards, similar things went on. The foreign minister came, and each time the Saudis would basically tell Hillary Clinton or the president or his other advisors, jump in the lake, we're not going to do anything. So he was led to believe that if he took these steps that the Arabists have always advocated, it would result in positive gains from the Saudis, and it didn't. The third thing that happened was in relation to the Israelis. Now, by coming out opposing the settlements, he might have gotten a fair amount of support from American Jews and from Israelis if he had limited his freeze or his call for a freeze to settlements in the West Bank. But what happened was he called for a freeze of settlements in Jerusalem as well. And for virtually all Israelis, right, center, and left, that is a red line, because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and for Barack Obama to tell the Israelis they don't have the right to build in their capital, from their perspective, is like if Israel told Americans they have no right to build in Washington, D.C. It was going too far. And so while he might have gotten support from part of the Israeli public and part of the American Jewish community that doesn't like settlements and would like to see Israel give them up, by doing that, by making that mistake, he undermined his own goal again of trying to get pressure on Israel to stop the settlements. The other thing that happened was that by focusing so much on the settlement issue and publicly criticizing Israel without at the same time seeming to put any pressure on the Arab side, he alienated most of the Israeli public. So that according to one poll, 4% of Israelis thought that President Obama was a friend of Israel. Now, most people in Washington, I can tell you, think that Barack Obama is a friend of Israel. They don't see him as an enemy. But it doesn't matter. What matters is what Israelis think. And whether they're right or wrong, as long as they have the perception that America is not behind them, it is impossible for Israel to take risks for peace. And whatever Israel does in terms of negotiations with the Palestinians in going forward is going to involve risks. And they need to feel America's behind them. And by his approach, they didn't feel that. So it undermined, again, his own objective of trying to get the Israelis to move forward on the peace. And at the same time, it also didn't work with the Palestinians. Because two things happened with the Palestinians. Number one, when the Palestinians saw that even after Obama made the settlement such a big issue, basically the Israelis continued to do some building. They didn't stop entirely, and they wouldn't stop in Jerusalem. And so from the Palestinian perspective and the perspective of much of the Arab world, Obama might be very well-meaning, but he was too weak to force Israel to do what they wanted. The other thing that happened in terms of the Palestinians is they never refused to negotiate because of settlements. Since 1993, the Palestinians have been negotiating with Israel, even while settlements were being built. There was never a demand for a freeze. Just a year before Obama demanded a freeze, they had been in negotiations with Prime Minister Olmert, who offered them 97% of the West Bank for a Palestinian state, which they turned down. So once Obama said, we want the Israelis to freeze settlements, now suddenly the Palestinians couldn't say, we are going to be less strict or less hard-line than the Americans about this. We have to go for a settlement freeze too. And so what ended up happening was, instead of them coming forward to negotiate with Israel, they refused for 9 months. So again, whether you like his policies or not, just by his own set of objectives, the first year was a failure in just about every way, because he took the Arab lobby's approach to the Middle East. Now things have begun to change. Things are changing in part because President Obama, I think, is a pretty smart guy. He's a good politician, and he recognized that it didn't work. And he replaced some of the Arabists who were running the show or influencing him on Middle East policy with a guy named Dennis Ross, who is not an Arabist, but probably the world's most experienced peace processor. And we seem to see some evidence that he's having an effect, because when Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Washington the second time, he was treated very well, given a very hearty welcome, as opposed to the first visit where he was humiliated. And that instead of beating Israel with sticks, now they're using carrots. That now they want Israel to continue the freeze on settlements, but rather than beating them up with some sort of threats, they have reportedly offered them a variety of carrots in terms of different things the United States is willing to do if they are willing to extend the freeze for a couple of months. At the same time, they're being much tougher on Abbas in not accepting his idea that he shouldn't have to negotiate, and that it's just a concession for him just to sit at the table in exchange for Israel freezing the settlements. And now there's much greater pressure and a recognition that Abbas was an obstacle for the last year to the negotiations, and that he has to be pressured. So we see a recalibration, I think, as not necessarily him adopting the Israeli lobby position wholly, but certainly moving away from the Arab lobby influence that I think was taking him down the wrong path the first year. And now we see at least some hope that there will be negotiations down the line that will lead to a peace settlement. Let me just finish with a historical anecdote, so that we leave on, at least I hope, a more positive note before I take questions. And that is, even when things look fairly pessimistic as they may today, there's historical precedent for thinking peace is possible. In 1947, do you know who was controlling Palestine? The English, Great Britain. And they decided to turn the question of what to do with Palestine over to the United Nations. And why did they do that? They believed that the UN would never be able to get the Jews and the Arabs to agree on a solution, and they would throw up their hands and say, you Brits, go do whatever you want. So the British advisor on Palestine was talking to one of the Zionist leaders one day, and he said, how did you let us take this issue to the United Nations? Don't you know that the only way that you're going to get a Jewish state is if the United States and the Soviet Union agree? He said, that will never happen. It's never happened. It can't possibly happen. Well, a few weeks later, for the first time in history, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. For 30 years, guys like me would talk to groups like you and say, the Arabs, they'll never make peace. It will never happen. It can't possibly happen. I can show you old propaganda where they used to say, Anwar Sadat, he's just like Hitler. Well, Hitler decided to go to Jerusalem in 1977. He broke the psychological barrier, subsequently made peace. It took 15 more years before King Hussein had the courage and vision to make peace, but he did. And so today we have peace between Israel and 2 Arab states, 2 Muslim states, which suggests to me that it is possible to have peace. If not maybe in 30 years and maybe in 15 years, God willing, it will happen much sooner. Thank you very much.
I'm Steve Goldberg. I'm going to be asking some questions. Some have been collected already, and others are being brought to me. First question of Dr. Barr. Is there any reliable evidence, not just rumor, that the Arab lobby helped suppress evidence of potential complicity by the royal family in the attacks of 9/11?
Did the Arab lobby suppress evidence
Correct.
related to Saudi involvement in the 9/11 attacks? There is no hard evidence I know of that the Arab lobby per se suppressed that. We know that there is a lot of redacted information that never came out in the report that continues to be classified, that certain members of Congress have suggested involves information about Saudi involvement. But a lot of what they do doesn't necessarily have to be direct. It can be indirect, the notion that people know that if you make the Saudis unhappy, bad things can happen. And that sometimes there have been more explicit threats, as in the case of the the lawsuit by survivors of 9/11 against a couple of Saudi royals, and the reports were that the Saudis threatened to pull out large amounts of money from the U.S. economy, and they've done that on other occasions as well.
How have the Saudis been lobbying the U.S. administration with respect to the Iranian threat?
How is the Arab lobby lobbying the government on the Iranian threat? Look, as I said, the principal concern of Saudi Arabia is the survival of the monarchy. And the Saudis and the other Gulf states are petrified of the Iranians, much more than the Israelis in many ways, because they're a lot closer, and the Iranians make no pretense about their designs on parts of the Gulf. In fact, they occupy one of the islands, I believe, owned by Bahrain. They're constantly having border disputes. And so the Saudis are scared to death of the Iranians. But the Saudis also are very scared of how they are dealt with. That if they don't think the United States will take action against the Iranians, then they will likely do one of two things. And actually they've already done both, and that is to try to buy off the Iranians, that they've gone and had meetings with Iran in the past few years to try to appease them. And at the same time, they have signed nuclear cooperation agreements, and they are likely to pursue a nuclear weapon. In fact, one of the biggest dangers, maybe you'll want to talk about the Iranian issue more generally, but one of the biggest dangers of the Iranian issue isn't Iran getting the bomb, but the fact that if they get the bomb, all the other Arab states are going to want it to protect themselves from Iran, and Saudis first among them.
Is it possible for pro-Israel organizations to combat the Arab lobby to the extent it's aimed at destroying Israel? And if so, how would you recommend that be done?
Can the Israeli lobby combat the Arab lobby? Well, first, much of the one of the things people ask sometimes is, if the Arab lobby is so powerful, how come U.S.-Israel relations are so strong, and how come U.S.-Palestinian relations aren't stronger? The fact is that most of the Arab lobby is not competing directly with the Israeli lobby. That the Saudi lobby is mostly, again, focused on what's good for Saudi Arabia, and cares less about Israel. The one time where the Saudi and Israeli lobbies tend to clash has been over arms sales, and that really hasn't happened since 1981, when the Arab lobby, in fact, defeated the Israeli lobby on the AWACS deal. Now, as far as the Arab American, the domestic lobby groups, they do clash, but it hasn't been a very fair fight because, again, the domestic Arab lobby groups have not had much success because they don't have public support, because they don't have a positive agenda, and most members of Congress aren't interested in separating U.S. policy from Israel. So I think what the pro-Israel lobby does is what they've always done, which is try to convince the American people that it's in the U.S. interest to strengthen the relationship, not necessarily to be anti-anybody else. In fact, the Israeli lobby are the ones that help the Egyptians and the Jordanians get foreign aid. They've typically not opposed aid to the Palestinians, so they tend to be more helpful than antagonistic. And the other thing about the Saudis that's kind of interesting when you read some of the State Department documents is the Saudis definitely don't like Israel. They would love that Israel didn't exist. But for the most part, Israel doesn't bother them. Israel is not a threat to the monarchy. So what you would see is in some of the meetings, the U.S. diplomat would be talking to the Saudi, and the Saudi king or foreign minister would say something like, you know, we really don't like Israel, we really wish you would do something about the Israelis, or we wish you would stop supporting Israel, and that would be in the first 30 seconds of the conversation, and then they would say, but what we really care about is, first it was the Hashemites, who they were afraid of in the 50s, and then it was Nasser, who they were afraid of in the 50s and 60s, and then it was the Soviets in the Cold War, and now it's Iran. So they may say, we really don't like Israel, and we wish you wouldn't support Israel when they talk to Barack Obama, but you can be sure within a couple of minutes it goes to the earlier question, and they say, but what we really are worried about is the Iranians, because they know Israel's not going to attack Saudi Arabia, but Iran might.
You mentioned the victory of the Saudi lobby over the pro-Israel lobby in 1981 with regard to the sale of AWACS. How has the power of the Arab lobby waxed and waned since that time over the various tenures of the presidential administrations? And how much of that change in their influence is dependent on the sympathy of the president versus the power of the lobby itself?
Oh, it's a good question. I'm not sure that the power has waxed and waned very much. Again, in terms of the Saudis, it's been pretty consistent. Every president has given in to Saudi coercion. And while there's always the talk about how close the Bushes were to the Saudis, and certainly true that they had a close relationship, but so did every other president in terms of their willingness to give in to the Saudis in terms of arms sales, in terms of various policy in the Middle East. So I don't think it's necessarily waxed and waned at all. It's been fairly consistent. But the question is a good one because the most important factor in determining U.S. Middle East policy is the president's ideology. It's not just about lobbies. What matters is what's the president's worldview. And the lobby that comes the closest to the president's worldview on any particular issue is the one that tends to have influence on him. So the presidents may have their own views on all of these issues, but when there is some question or when there is conflict between the views of advisors, the one whose views are consistent with the president's ideology wins. And to give you an example, in the Truman administration, here was one of the most pro-Israel presidents who was, after all, the one responsible for supporting partition, the one responsible for recognizing Israel, and he accepted the advice of the pro-Israel lobby and the pro-Israel advisors who wanted him to support partition and who wanted him to support the recognition of Israel. But at the same time, he also embargoed arms to the Jewish state, which made it much more difficult for them to defend themselves in the war of independence. Why did he do that? Well, in that case, he went along with the advisors from the State Department who convinced him that this would be a way of reducing bloodshed. And part of his ideology, Truman's ideology, was that he was hoping to avoid bloodshed. So this is one way that you influence presidents. Now, to take Barack Obama, for example, you can't prove all the time where the lobbying influence starts and where it it ends. In the case of his views on settlements, I suspect that he has very strong personal opposition to settlements. And maybe somewhere earlier in his career, someone put that idea into his head or influenced him in a way, but certainly today, I don't think he needs to be pushed to oppose settlements. That's something he feels very strongly about.
Do you believe there will be lobbying in support of a UN unilateral declaration of the Palestinian state sometime in 2011? Will the Saudis and other Arab nations be pushing that along with the Europeans? And how, if that's going to happen, can the pro-Israel organizations combat that?
Well, is there going to be an effort to declare a unilateral Palestinian state? There's been more and more discussion of that. And one of the parts of the Arab lobby that I really don't talk about so much in the book until I talk about a little bit at the end is the foreign component. And that probably in some ways part of the strongest parts of the lobby are from the Europeans, the United Nations, and some of the international non-governmental organizations. And the Europeans basically have already said that they're prepared to recognize a state of Palestine. The one thing that separates the desire to have a unilateral Palestinian state and actually having one is the U.S. position. That as long as the United States is unwilling to recognize a state of Palestine that hasn't been created through negotiations, it's not very likely that it will be created. And even though there will be pressure from the UN or from European governments and certainly from Arab states, it's not going to happen unless the United States is convinced of it.
How much do you believe that Arab money, Saudi money, has influenced former Presidents Carter and now Clinton to come out against Israel?
Well, in terms of Carter, if you've seen his diary that came out or read the excerpts, you can see that he was no friend of Israel when he was the president. That it's really quite remarkable when you read his comments about just about every Israeli leader he has nothing good to say about, but he loves every Arab dictator. Hafez Assad, the guy who murdered 20,000 of his own people in Hama, was a wonderful guy, great sense of humor, great peacemaker. The Saudi king, who was leading an apartheid government, great guy, terrific peace enthusiast, even though he undermined Camp David, and on and on. So I don't think that necessarily the Saudi money afterwards to the Carter Center, and they've given a lot, was a major influence. I think that Carter already had his own views and his own animus towards Israel. And there are a variety of people ask all the time, why is Jimmy Carter so anti-Israel, and why does he have the attitudes that he does? And there are at least a few reasons. One is that Carter tends to confuse his initials with someone else that has the same initials. Second, one of the reasons he really dislikes Yitzhak Rabin, supposedly, was there's a famous story that when Yitzhak Rabin came to the White House, President Carter asked him if he wanted to say goodnight to Amy, and Rabin, in his not very tactful self, said no, and Carter never quite forgave him for that. On a more serious note, he has never gotten over his belief that the Israelis, and Begin specifically, lied to him about a settlement freeze during Camp David. Menachem Begin promised to freeze settlements for 3 months. Carter is convinced to this day, even though all the Israelis say he's wrong, that he had promised to do it for the length of the peace negotiations, and he basically is very bitter about that, which, by the way, also the settlement freeze for 3 months didn't work then and was a good precedent for why it's not working now. And finally, as he talks about in the diary, he's very bitter because he was defeated for re-election, in part because Jews abandoned him in droves, that he got the lowest Jewish vote of any Democrat since, I believe, 1924. Because American Jews did not believe that he was a friend of Israel. And he seems to be totally puzzled by this now. Oh, as far as Clinton, look, Clinton was, I think, along with George W. Bush, if not the most pro-Israel president in history, in a close tie. And whether he's now saying things that are not the most sympathetic, he said something that was, quite frankly, pretty idiotic the other day, of blaming Russian Jews for the lack of peace in the Middle East, it seemed. But you have to understand that he is trying to help the Obama administration. He's trying to help his wife, the Secretary of State, and supporting their policy. And I don't think he's turned against Israel. I think he's certainly remains a friend of Israel, and as president, he was a great friend of Israel. So, even friends of Israel, though, keep in mind, and I talked about this in the last book I wrote called Why Israel, or Will Israel Survive? I talked about George W. Bush, who I said was, along with Clinton, the most pro-Israel president, but you could look at a whole number of decisions he made that were, anti-Israel in a way, or were critical or punitive against Israel. No president is going to do everything Israel wants, and that's okay.
If Israel and the pro-Israel lobby began to take the position that the evidence shows that a Palestinian state would be a mistake and contrary both to the safety and security of Israel and to the stability in the Middle East, which is the United States' interest, would there be any possibility of turning around the ship which is heading in the direction of pushing for a Palestinian state?
If the pro-Israel lobby in America concluded that a two-state solution was not in Israel's interest, would there be a way of changing the policy? The basic philosophy of the Israeli lobby has been that the people of Israel living in a democracy have the right, through their democratic representatives, to determine all issues related to peace and security. And that the government of Israel makes those decisions, and those of us who are 6,000 or more miles away are not in a position to tell the people of Israel, who have to live with the consequences, whose children have to fight in wars and go to the army, what they should live with. That's the traditional Israeli lobby position. And the problem, if you don't have that position, then what consistent basis could a lobby have for policy? If you don't go by what the Israeli government wants, is it just by the majority of a particular group of Jews in a particular place, or a particular Jewish organization or pro-Israel organization, or how are you going to come up with a policy? It's very difficult to conceive of how you would have any kind of consistent policy that would make any sense if you didn't do that. Now, there's another lobby out there that has taken a different view. And it's basically the Arab lobby view that I described earlier, which is we in America know what's best for Israel, and the Israelis are too, again, stupid, immature, politically constrained, evil. For whatever reason, they can't do what's best for them, and therefore the United States has to go and beat them to a pulp until they do what's good for them. And that's a view of a particular lobby here who is unsatisfied with Israeli policy. And because they can't win over the people of Israel to their point of view, they're trying to force it on the people of Israel. And it's the same thing with the Walton Mearsheimer argument, the people who are unhappy with the Israeli lobby. The problem isn't that the Israeli lobby is all-powerful, or that the people like Walton Mearsheimer and Jimmy Carter are silenced and don't get to express their view. The problem is their views aren't persuasive. They've lost the debate. And rather than simply accept the fact that most Americans don't agree with them, they believe that somehow they're being persecuted, and that the policy should be whatever they say it is, even though that's not what most Americans believe. So I think to answer the question, no, I don't believe the Israeli lobby is going to change the policy of the State of Israel. The State of Israel has come around for its own reasons, from the belief one day of a Palestinian state being too dangerous, to the idea of a confederation with Jordan, to now the last several prime ministers believing a two-state solution is the best opportunity for Israel to have peace. And again, the Israeli lobby, I'm not going to advocate a position one way or the other. I'm just going to tell you the position of the establishment Israeli lobby is to support the elected government of Israel.
And if the Israeli government were to revert back to the original position...
We'll spin our heads around like Linda Blair.
If it did that, would there be a possibility of getting the Christian Zionists and the Jewish organizations to back the Israeli government in now rejecting a Palestinian state?
I don't foresee the policy going backwards for a whole variety of reasons. But as I say, I mean, this is one of the things that I always found absurd about criticism of AIPAC, that people who would say AIPAC's become this right-wing Republican organization. AIPAC, whether you like it or not, goes by the policy of the government of Israel. And if the government of Israel tomorrow says we're giving up the Golan Heights, AIPAC is going to come out with talking points for why Israel can give up the Golan Heights. And I can tell you, for how many years, since '73, we've had the Israeli lobby has had talking points for why that is bad for Israel's security. But if Israel decides that that is something it can live with, the pro-Israel lobby is going to support it. And just as now the pro-Israel lobby supports the two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state. Not everybody likes it. Everybody, I think, understands that there are dangers and problems, but as long as that's the government policy, that's what they're going to support. If somehow a new government comes to power with a completely different perspective, if something happens in the Middle East that causes everybody to change their views, if the Hashemites fall from power in Jordan and suddenly the Palestinians take over Jordan, Hezbollah takes over Lebanon, the Muslim Brotherhood takes over Egypt, all things that could happen, by the way. You don't know what change in policy might be. But for now, I don't see a reason why we're going to go back to a confederation with Jordan, because the Jordanians don't want it. And most Israelis agree that they're willing to give up the territories in exchange for peace.
Is the Arab lobby more influential among either political party?
Is the Arab lobby more influential in either political party? Not really. They aren't very influential within the parties at all because, again, they have very small numbers. They contribute relatively little money directly to campaigns. And most of what they do is, again, focus not on the bottom up and on the Congress, where they have a difficult time having influence, but they focus more on the State Department and the White House, where they can have direct influence. And it doesn't matter whichever party's there. And in the case of the State Department, it's a permanent bureaucracy. And by winning friends in the permanent bureaucracy, then when the parties change power, or the White House changes hands, it doesn't affect the State Department that much because you have these entrenched Arabists trying to keep policy consistent with their views. But if you look historically, I think probably there are more Arab Americans involved in the Democratic Party. They've had probably greater access through the Democratic Party. Not a great deal of influence, but they're overwhelmingly registered as Democrats, but whether they have much influence, I don't think so.
You mentioned that in Washington, D.C., President Obama is considered to be a friend of Israel. Based on what?
One of the problems with assessing the U.S.-Israel relationship is that it tends to be entirely through the prism of the peace process and what's reported in the New York Times or on CNN. And the U.S.-Israel relationship is not the peace process. Whenever there is any kind of tension in the peace process, it gives the impression that the relationship is in trouble, that there's a crisis, that whoever has caused the tension is somehow critical of Israel. If you look, though, at the broad web of relationships between the United States and Israel, they're stronger, deeper than ever before, some of which Obama has contributed to in terms of a lot of new military cooperation. You know, they're just agreed to sell Israel the new, most advanced stealth fighter plane. There's been a number of other military developments. Israel is being, the United States is fully funding one of the anti-rocket, anti-missile systems. There's a lot of cooperation going on that you don't read about in the New York Times. It's not sexy. You know, each of the 50 states have relationships with Israel. Something like 22 have their own agreements on a state-to-state basis. States like California do something on the order of $1 billion worth of trade with Israel every year. You have relationships between most of the universities in the United States and universities in Israel. You have exchanges of police going to Israel, of various security officials. You have all kinds of things going on between the United States and Israel that just don't get the publicity, which are really the true indicators of the strength of the relationship. And President Obama, as I said, I think that he pursued an approach in the Middle East in the first year, which by his own standards was counterproductive. But in terms of his overall interest in, I think, Middle East peace, I'm not convinced that he's anti-Israel. There may be things that he could do that some people would like better, but I don't think it's that he's got a particular animus against Israel.
Final question. How warmly received has your book been by the Arab lobby and by its market in the United States government?
How warmly received has been the book. Everybody loves my book. Just ask my mother. There's been, the reviews have been pretty consistently positive. Most of the Arab lobby wants it to go away, and I don't think they want to talk about it. But, it's interesting when you write a book, because you find out some very interesting things about how people review books. For example, one thing you discover is people like to review books without reading them. And it's sort of like a Ponzi scheme where one person reviewed my book and didn't like who wrote the blurb on the back. And so said nasty things about the book, and then someone else then quoted the first guy, and then the third person quoted the second guy, and none of the three actually had read the book. Or another guy who criticized the book for being lightly referenced, lightly footnoted. Ladies and gentlemen, this book has over 600 footnotes, hardly lightly footnoted. So, you take some of the criticism with a grain of salt, but overwhelmingly, read the Review and Commentary magazine, or the National Review Online, or Alan Dershowitz's review that was in the Jerusalem Post and the Daily Beast, and a variety of other places. There was a full-page Q&A in Haaretz this last week. So, I'm pretty pleased with the reception it's gotten, because this is fundamentally based on research. This isn't my personal opinions. This was based on hundreds and hundreds of documents, primary documents from the State Department, interviews from the leading State Department officials who were involved in making policy. This is many years in the making, so I'm pretty confident that this is something that can stand any criticism and will inform you, I think, about a great deal of things that you probably never knew were going on behind your backs. And that now that you know, hopefully you can do something about it. Thank you very much.